Okay, so I'm going to just briefly kind of introduce the topic of the rise of the state, and then I'll speak about Israel more. And when we talk about the rise of the state, what we're really talking about is the emergence of civilization. And believe it or not, it has happened on more than one occasion independently. So on the other hand, it's a pretty rare event for it to happen. There are 6 places in the world where we have the independent rise of the state, and you can see them on the map. The other thing, though, is that archaeologists at this point have a pretty good understanding of not only the rise of the state, but how to identify it in the archaeological record. I would say the keys to all of this, number one, is when you're dealing with a state-level society, you're dealing with the emergence of cities. The other thing is that you have the rise then of specialization. In order to support these administrators and this new class of specialists, you must have a very significant agricultural surplus. All right, so it is not inevitable that states will arise. It is not simply that you go from, say, bands to tribes to chiefdoms to states, but there is something qualitatively different about a state. It's not just a bigger chiefdom or a bigger tribal society. And I think you'll see that in the case of China as well. The land of Israel, which is written as Canaan, or Canaan here, was not the locus of primary innovation for the state. So the Canaanite state, which does begin about 5,000 years ago, so maybe about 500 years after Mesopotamia, 200 to 300 years after the state evolves in Egypt, it is considered a secondary state. So in many ways, it was inspired by events that happened in Egypt and in Mesopotamia. As the Canaanite state emerges 5,000 years ago, it is mostly of petty kingdoms, little city-states, as opposed to a unified state that you would say, like have an ancient Rome or an ancient Egypt. And we find, so beginning 5,000 years ago, in the land of Israel, there is excellent evidence for state-level society. We have cities that are surrounded and fortified by walls. Each city has a palace. There are temples. There are large storage facilities. There is a cultural tradition of an artistic tradition that develops. All of these things. Mathematics develops. Ultimately, it takes a little while longer. They're using other writing systems, but ultimately a new writing system will emerge. Olives and olive oil. It's a little bit of a disappointment when I have to tell the students they were not eating the Mediterranean diet as far. This wasn't for salad. The oil was basically used for light, right? So this was the preferred fuel for the burning of light, for lamps, for menorahs, right? So that was a big export, a lot of demand from Egypt for that. And the second thing that was a big product for the land of Israel, and today is still, is a major product, of course, is wine. And both of these products require a certain temperature in order to fully ripen, which they did not achieve very well in Egypt. But was obviously achieved quite well in the land of Israel. Both of these plants are indigenous to the land of Israel and to sort of this area, and so they did quite well, and this was an important part of the economy. By the time we have ancient Israel, which the Israelite state under King David emerges at 1000 BCE, so 3,000 years ago, keep in mind, there had been a Canaanite state already for 2,000 years. Okay, so it's not a primary state. The green is where that's the heartland of the state of Israel, and then the orange and the red are referring to the Philistines. So the state of Israel emerges in the hill country. There's a couple factors to keep in mind. One is that the state emerges at a time where there's no outside interference. So this is a time in history when there's really no dominant empire. As a result, you sort of have this power vacuum. And that gives these little tiny nation states an opportunity to flourish and to grow. And they're not independent. Prior to the state, right? If you know your biblical history, It's known as the period of the judges. You're dealing with just a simple agrarian society. And when trouble emerges, a charismatic leader kind of rises up, helps take care of the problem, and then as soon as the problem is solved, goes back to a regular life. And Israel is confronted with a situation where you had pretty much a very nice, almost egalitarian society where everybody's simple farmers. And there is a certain hesitancy about becoming a state, right? We hear in the Bible, it talks about how the warning that be careful about, because they say we want a king, we need a king, we need to be organized in order to confront the Philistines, otherwise they're going to attack us and destroy us. And there's a warning. Listen, you get a king, he's going to enslave you, he's going to tax you. It's not going to be this really comfortable life. So they are aware of what will happen, right? It's because they're not a primary state. They know what a state is. They've been to Egypt. They see the Canaanites. They've seen the Philistines. They know what the trade-offs are. And yet, in order to preserve their way of life and not be engulfed by the Philistines, they ended up having to become a state. So what does the state look like? So the state at the beginning in the land of Israel, and this is something to keep in mind when you compare with the Chinese example, it is tiny, okay? It is very, very small, but nevertheless, it is a true state. This is a state that's really what they call a regal ritual city. It's really a place, ultimately, you don't see it here yet because this is David's city, so there's no temple, but it's a place for the king to live and his family, for his dynasty, and it is also a place for the temple, for the main spiritual center. It is basically a spiritual political center, and that's about it. This is an artist's construction of David's palace. Again, this is, it's a reconstruction. It's not, all we have maybe are the foundation stones. So in the next generation under Solomon, we have the building of the temple, and that really solidifies that it's a spiritual center. It's the main base for the religious life. And so at this point, I think I'm going to stop talking and let Debbie continue going. Thank you.